Okay, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. My name is Danijela Milic, and I am the Human Resources Policies Officer at the United Nations, and also one of the board members of AHRMIO. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which is going to be on topic of future of work and digital well-being. This webinar is a partnership between AHRMIO and Allianz, which is one of our sponsors. I presume most of you know about AHRMIO, but briefly, AHRMIO is the Association of HR Management in International Organization. And just as the name suggests, it brings together HR professionals and leaders from a variety of different sectors, not just international organizations, but also the academia and the private sector. And this year we are particularly proud because we are celebrating our 20th anniversary. And we are really grateful to have Allianz Partners as one of our sponsors. So in this webinar, we're going to be discussing, as the topic says, the future of work. We're going to be talking about together what does the workplace of the future look like? How will the workplace digitization impact employee well-being and mental health? And also what can the HR functions and staff do to support well-being? So this session will be recorded. So those of you who are here, and if you need to step out or maybe miss something, there will be an opportunity for you to have the recording as well. There will be time at the end for questions and answers, but you don't have to wait till the end to ask your questions. Please make use of the Q&A function on screen, and throughout the discussion, you could be putting your questions forward. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our distinguished panel that we have for you today. We have 3 different speakers. One is Beth Warne. She's a senior analyst in the public policy team of the Economist Intelligence Unit. Her focus is on technology and society, in particular, how businesses and government agencies can use data to design better policies, programs, and initiatives. Her recent work examines digital well-being during COVID-19, upcoming IoT regulations, and the role of the big data in socioeconomic research. Before joining the EIU, Beth worked on public sector transformation in the Middle East and studied in the London School of Economics and Science for Paris. The second speaker we have is Dr. Ulrike Sucher. She is the medical director for the international health business of Allianz Partners. For the last 17 years, Ulrike has been responsible for ensuring the highest standards of medical care for Allianz Partners worldwide. Previously, she has over 15 years of experience as general practitioner, and she's fluent in German, Spanish, and English. But for today, we're going to just keep her asking her to speak in English, since this webinar is in English. And last but certainly not least, we have Peter Thomson. He's an expert on the changing world of work and its impact on organizations, leadership, and management. He regularly speaks on the topic of at conferences and has worked with many groups of managers and employees to inspire them to change their organizational culture. He is the director of the Future Work Forum, a think tank of leading consultants. After a career in HR in the technology sector, Peter became a visiting fellow at the Henley Business School, and for the 16 years he studied the changing patterns of work and the leadership implication of those trends. At the same time, he formed WiseWork Ltd, now a leading consultancy in the field of smart working. Peter is a co-author of the best-selling book Future Work and a new book, 500%. He regularly blogs on topics related to new working practices. It's an impressive biography. I try to shorten it, but of course, when you have a lengthy career such as our distinguished panelists, that becomes a tough job. But I try to at least give a little bit of a flavor for that. So let me just, with that introduction, let me open the discussion by inviting Beth to present the new report from the Economist Intelligence Unit, where she works, which has been supported by Allianz Partners. And that new report is entitled COVID-19, Double-Edged Sword of Greater Work Possibility and Increased Isolation Requires Urgent Action by Employers. So Beth, over to you to tell us more about the study and your findings.
Great, thank you very much. And Danijela, thank you very much for that kind introduction. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So as Danijela just mentioned, we partnered with Allianz at the start of this year, back in April 2020, at the start of the pandemic, with the aim of doing research to answer 3 broad questions. So firstly, we wanted to understand how COVID-19 was changing and has changed how we work. Secondly, we wanted to look at the impact this has been having on employee well-being. And thirdly, and most importantly, what companies should be doing to support their workforce through these changes. As Danijela mentioned, the report is now available, and I think the link should be in the chat. So if you want to follow up on any of these, please do feel free to click on that. I'm going to go through our overall findings very quickly today, so we can get onto a fantastic panel discussion. But if you have any questions, please do feel free to put them in the Q&A. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was this idea that even before the pandemic, technology was driving fundamental changes in how we work. And though we found ourselves in this awful situation, the silver lining for me is the fact that it's forced companies to actually look at how digitalization was impacting their employee well-being and really engage with it in a way that previously, because the changes weren't as immediate and as grand as we've seen in COVID-19, really companies weren't doing. So before we look at the COVID-19 changes, I wanted to just briefly introduce how over the last kind of 20 years, we've seen technology impact how people work. At The Economist, we tend to break this down into 3 broad buckets. Firstly, we talk about the rise of the knowledge economy and how, as companies benefit from having expertise and the people become their main asset, that's changed how people work. Typically, this is the rise of the global teams. So in the UK at the moment, 48% of corporate teams include team members not only from different countries, but also residing in different countries. So you have global connections happening now. Secondly, and most visibly for most of us on this webinar today, has been the rise of digital communications. And the impact of this has been increased connectedness across the board. It's now easier to reach both your further colleagues, but also your clients and your networks at any time of the day. This has positives in terms of productivity, but also negatives in terms of that idea of an always-on culture and how that impacts well-being. And lastly is the trend around the advent of mobile computing. So before COVID-19, we used to talk about this as a kind of work from anywhere. So incorporating the fact that it meant you could, elongate your work day by doing an hour both ends on the commute, or work from holiday, work while you're on holiday, work from home, etc. But now in COVID-19, we've seen this change basically transform into everyone working from home. So at the peak of the pandemic back in April, the ILO said that 80% of workers in the world had some kind of form of restrictions. And what we've seen now as the second wave hits and prolongs in North America and Europe, that trend is becoming something that people have experienced for kind of 8 to 6 months. So in terms of how these trends have been impacted by COVID-19, across the board, what we've seen is not so much a shift, but an acceleration in industry areas. And in many ways, this has actually been positive for people who have had to change how they work, and the kind of upside of this means that after the pandemic has ended, after restrictions have been lifted, and now with the vaccine, we can start planning for that and hopefully see that coming down the line. These changes are likely to continue because people's preferences have changed, people's working habits are likely to change long term. One key area of this is people have actually responded quite well in general across the board to working from home. So 2/3 of the people we talked about in a survey, it was a survey of 1,000 people across 5 high-income countries, now want to work from home at least 3 days a week. This is a big change. It's a shift from having most people working for the majority of their time in the office to the counter of that. So most people working for the majority of time at home. Another benefit is that almost 3/4 of people now feel more comfortable doing their parts of their job online. And in particular, we've seen gains around kind of communication and working with others. Whereas previously people felt that collaboration was something that was much harder to do remotely, because they've been forced to over the last 6 months, actually people have made improvements and feel more comfortable doing this in this space. Another really important finding is that though people's individual preferences have moved, also their ideas and beliefs about what their teams and their juniors can do remotely has also shifted. So prior to the pandemic, one thing that we saw was that it was often middle management that was a challenge or a break on flexible working practices. And during the pandemic, we've seen those people's attitudes change in line with their own, suggesting that these people are now going to be more open to juniors and people in their broader teams having the same benefits that they've often enjoyed. On the flip side of this, I mean, it hasn't been a broadly positive experience, and there have been particular challenges for groups, both at a macro and a micro level. So at a macro level, a really interesting finding and a surprising finding for us across the board was this idea that some countries have had a much less positive experience than others. France, for me, was the standout, and you can kind of link this back to a more hierarchical corporate culture, potentially. We've done research on that in the past. But almost across the board, in terms of productivity, in terms of support from employees, you saw a real dip in France's performance versus other high-income countries. On a more micro level, you're seeing big changes, but you're seeing big varied experiences between parents and non-parents, and this was something that got a lot of media attention during the pandemic. Was the idea that, especially for women, this idea that work comes into the home actually amplifies inequalities when it comes from non-paid for work and housework in the home. And the idea that, especially with children, those kind of the distraction element, and there's been a lot of smiling moments of people getting interrupted on national news, etc. Children in the home are a big barrier to kind of working productively remotely. One thing that got less attention, though, but was also really important, was age. So in lots of cases, age and digital literacy are strongly correlated. And what we saw is that a lot of older employees that we spoke to, so people, the cut is age over 45. I'm not saying that those people are older, but that's the barrier. So people over the age of 45 were much keener to access digital support services and access help with using online tools. And where that support wasn't on offer, their self-reported productivity fell more than for younger people. So you saw them struggle more with kind of producing documents online, for example. In terms of what companies should do with this information, and in terms of what a company's next step might be, this is something we're going to talk about extensively in the panel discussion, so I'm just going to introduce it very briefly here. Our big finding and our big recommendation was that it's really important to see this as a structural change and a transformation that has to be addressed at all three organizational levels, if kind of cultural and leadership, policy and provision, and also at tools. By just making changes in one of these areas, all you're doing is creating a gap in another area where people can start to fall through. You've got to have that broad culture where people can talk about their challenges and seek help. You've got the policies in place where they kind of frame what that support's going to look like, and the tools that people can physically access or digitally access to make that transition smoother. But again, that's something we'll talk about more in the panel. The last thing I wanted to briefly mention was this idea around mental health, because all through our research, this was emerging as a really important issue that companies need to engage with. COVID-19 has been an extremely difficult challenge for a lot of people and has had a negative impact on a lot of people's mental health. We did our initial survey back in the summer, and even by that point, so kind of 3 months of working from home, almost half the people we spoke to have felt their isolation increase, and a third were concerned about the long-term effects on their mental health. This is a real challenge for businesses to address, because it's a real risk to getting the most out of their employees over the next kind of 6 months as restrictions are likely to continue, but also kind of in the long term. In terms of what companies can do about this, I find it very easy to break it down into what can be done today, what can be done by the end of the year, and then what can be done in kind of the 6 months where we're going to see restrictions continue. So today, I think the most important thing that managers can do at every level is just to check that the support services brought in at the start of the pandemic, be that kind of check-ins or virtual drinks or virtual team building, those kind of things are still happening. People are still going and being encouraged to go, and that they haven't kind of slipped by the wayside. I definitely hear and experience Zoom fatigue and kind of virtual meetups fatigue. So it's time to kind of get creative, especially in the run up to Christmas. Like, how can you reinvigorate connections? How can you make sure that this support is still happening today? In the kind of next 3 weeks, so before the end of the year, I would encourage all companies to do an audit of their mental health support services and how they're going online, and make sure there are digital replicas of everything they currently offer their employees in person online. So that might be health insurance sign-up windows, it might be counseling services going online, but just doing as you would do a financial audit, looking at every provision that you offer to your employees in person and make sure that there is an online digital twin of that employees can access. And then the last thing, and the kind of last thing from me, is this kind of 6 months, over the next 6 months, what should companies be focused on? And one thing that came through the data really clearly is that people are not having enough conversations with their immediate line managers around their digital well-being, around their mental health. And our key recommendation here is over the next 6 months, make sure everyone in your organization who manages another employee is comfortable talking to that person about their well-being, about their mental health, and doing that conversation, having that conversation online. Companies need to be ready that this is not something automatically their managers will be capable or able or comfortable to do. And that's okay, that's not their fault. Like, it's a difficult conversation. Often it kind of breaks taboos around, unfortunately, there's still taboos around mental well-being, and that takes a bit of time and some guidance to help overcome them. And the good thing though here is that there are training and there is provision out there for companies to upskill their managers to be able to have these conversations. So over the next 6 months, our key recommendation is a rollout of these kind of trainings, of this advice, so every person managing someone else in your organization is comfortable talking to them about their mental health. On that note, I will stop sharing my screen and hand back to Danijela, and we can get some thoughts and response from this from the panel. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Beth. And I know it's a lengthy and a report full of interesting data. And thank you for giving us the highlights and certainly the essence of it. And the link has been shared in the chat for you to look into deeper after the session. But it was very interesting for what you mentioned, that we need to be seeing this as a structural change at all levels rather than a patchwork and kind of fixing and adding things as we go along. I mean, the COVID is here for a lot longer than I think we initially anticipated, and I very much it resonated with me, this digital twin, rather than just doing something while we're holding up for the return to whatever we're hoping to return to. So I really interesting perspectives from that essence, from that aspect, and also that we need to prioritize employee mental health. I mean, there is one issue that it emerged very strongly this year. It is the issue of employee mental health. So that actually gets me to the question that I have, and I think, Peter, I'm gonna start with you, because as a director of the Future of Work Forum, can you tell us, how in your view the future of work will impact our mental health, and what can employees do? How can employees take better care of themselves?
Yeah, right. Well, for me, what's fascinating is the fact that all of a sudden at the beginning of this year, well, I guess at the very beginning of this year, if you'd have said, sometime in March or April, we'll just lock everybody at home and tell them they can't even go out and they've got to work from home, I'd have said you were mad, right? But all of a sudden we had this incredible experiment in work. And as we've already heard from Beth, there was a trend towards more mobile technology enabled working anyway. And so what the COVID did was just, in a brutal way, accelerated that change. And of course, what's happened is if you put people at home and they can't get out, they're stuck in there, perhaps a single parent with children. Not only that, the schools and the nurseries are now closed, so they've got to be being a teacher and a carer, as well as trying to still hold down their daytime job. Wow, that's going to be stressful for people. And of course, all the advice about implementing remote home working in the past has been, you don't just do it suddenly, you prepare for it, you get the right technology in place, you train the managers so they know how to deal with people working from home. And you certainly, in most cases, don't have people working permanently from home. Very few people, I think, are happy with being at home all the time. But as we've seen from the statistics, 70% are saying, actually, I'd quite like to work at the home for some of the time, maybe 3 days a week. And what it's done is raise that possibility for people where they haven't had it in the past. So we're moving towards a more hybrid world of work, where people will spend some time working at home or remotely, and some time going back into the normal workplace to meet people face to face. And we'll get the right balance of that. But so I think we need to be careful about not judging home working by an unusual situation where it's been forced on people full time, which quite rightly has had an impact on people's mental health. Although for me, the interesting thing with mental health is it's also, for quite a lot of people, had the opposite effect. People have lost the stress of commuting. They haven't got to rush in the public transport to get into work at a fixed time and make sure they're there on time. They haven't been working long hours in the office in boring meetings all day. And they've actually discovered that they can take a break at lunchtime and go and sit in the garden and hear the birds and deal with nature and so on. Oh, and they get to see the kids before they go to bed, as opposed to normally they don't, fathers, but also working mothers, often don't get enough time with family life. So people have rediscovered their local communities in some cases. So there's a whole change in people's lives being forced on them, and they've had a chance to stop and think about a new way of life. So there's been some positive mental health effects as well, people getting less stressed, less in the rat race, and more able to reflect back on life. And also I think it's made people, managers and leaders in some cases, stop and think about individuals as people, not as machines that come to work. Because through Zoom and so on, they've seen that they've kind of had a little entry into people's home. They've seen the pets, the cats, the partner walking in the background, and all that kind of human stuff. Oh, and the leaders themselves turn out to be human because they also have homes and they forget to unmute and all the rest of it. So it's been a kind of leveling process as well to some extent. And yes, Zoom and Teams and all the technology can be impersonal, but I think a lot of people, having got used to it, quite like the idea of contact through the electronic media. So I see a balanced effect on health. Clearly, isolation is bad for mental health, and I think we're going to end up with a world where people try and get the best of both worlds, get some of the peace and quiet of working from home when they want to, but also get the human contact, which we've clearly missed, of working in teams back in the office. So what can employers do about it? I think managers need to be much more sensitive to people as individuals and think about their mental health and be open about the discussion about isolation and so on. And I think it's happened accidentally through the lockdown and the COVID impact, that the discussion about mental health has become higher up the leaders' agenda, still probably not high enough, and it's become okay to talk about the stresses of working remotely, whereas I think before it was not a very popular subject amongst managers and leaders. And then I think HR clearly has a key role to play here in supporting managers, not just issuing policies, but actually providing advice and coaching. I think for some of those managers who are still a bit in the authoritarian hierarchical background, it was interesting to see from the Economist data that hierarchical cultures struggle more with this kind of freedom of work, because by definition, if people are working remotely, they're less able to be closely supervised, and therefore they have more freedom to choose when and where and how they get the job done, which is a challenge for some managers who think their role is to tell people what to do. And so there's a revolution in management, which is to do with trusting and empowering people. Again, things that HR people use a lot as expressions, but it really comes to the fore when you can't stand over somebody and look at what they're doing. You can't tell them what to do when. You've got to trust that they'll do. And surprise, surprise, productivity in the home working experiment has actually been fairly even gone up in many cases, whereas many managers thought it was going to go down. So I think there's a positive spin as long as we're concerned about the isolation effect.
Thank you very much for your insights, Peter. Very interesting. Before I move to the next question, I just want to check with whether Ulrike or Beth would like to add something on this question.
Well, I would just like to say, to totally echo what Peter has said, but there's just one thing that I think that will be difficult to solve by digital media and things like that is this availability of informal sources of support. And when I say that, I mean it's that chat while having a coffee in the kitchen, or while walking to the next building, or at the lunch break that you have, where you vent your frustration with the boss or another colleague and these things. So this is something that definitely people are going to miss, I'm afraid.
That's an interesting point. I can certainly echo that as well. So then let me actually, since we have you on the screen, Ulrike, let me throw the next question your direction. And first of all, good evening to you, and thank you for staying up very late to be with us here all the way from Thailand. We appreciate it. So you are the Chief Medical Officer for the International Health at Allianz Partners. So the question really, what I have from you, and I'm interested to hear this different perspective, you know, from one was from HR, now we're going more from the health side. From your perspective, what can HR and other leaders learn from COVID-19? And how will this influence the future of mental health at the workplace?
Yeah, let me maybe start by saying that as a global international insurer, we have the unique opportunity to witness firsthand what an impact the pandemic had in the different areas of the world on our insured members, who are mainly working age expats and their families, and they're in all the different corners of the world. So what we noticed is that the utilization of our multilingual EAP, the Employee Assistance Program, has doubled in comparison to pre-COVID times. I'm sure your as HR managers are all very well aware that an employee assistance program is there to help, to give counseling with personal problems, academic problems, bereavement, relationship, financial. So this is there to help the employees when they want a confidential kind of support. And the utilization, as I said, it has doubled in comparison to pre-COVID times. We noticed that women used it more than men. Well, I mean, that's typical. Men don't go to the doctor either, so it's probably something that women would do anyways. And families with children under the age of 12 would also access it more often, and so would single members more than the rest of our insured population. At the same time, kind of simultaneously, our classic psychiatry, psychotherapy claims increased by 50% since the outbreak of the pandemic in comparison to last year. So all this clearly confirms the detrimental effect the pandemic has had on our population's mental health. Just to put this in context, mental health and mental illness are actually at the ends of a continuum, from a completely healthy status on one side, that's the happy camper, then going into reacting to stress but dealing with it, and then on to what we call the injured status, when balance is lost and the compensation starts, onto the other side of the spectrum, the acute or chronic mental illness. So what can we recommend to the leadership of an organization from our medical health insurance point of view? I would say it's down to the 3 C's. C for clear, proactive communication to your employees, and that is make them aware of your stance on mental health, your preparedness to help. What are the tools that are available to them? One of them is EAP. Another one is a really good international or domestic, whatever you are, in what area you are in, health insurer that will cover all the support you might need on the mental health sides. Then care. When I say care, it's genuine support which can be tailored to individual employees and to groups of employees, because not one size fits all. You can't say, okay, everybody has got to work and have these lunch breaks and these breaks. This is different for a woman who is maybe a single parent to a child, or a young person who doesn't have the space, a separate room to work in. All these things need to be tailored. And the third C is control. Implement a sort of NPS to record the effectiveness of your endeavors. Kind of see how satisfied is your employeeship with what you're doing. That can be done in a confidential manner, but just make sure you are really there to support your employees.
Thank you very much, Ulrike. Very great tips for us as HR, and also for leaders who are listening down there. What can we learn? Thank you very much for your insights. I'm going to turn to Beth to see. Beth, do you have anything to add to this, or we move on?
No, I think that was very comprehensive, very comprehensive.
Okay, great. Before we move on, because I want to make sure also that we leave some time at the end for questions and answers, so please continue to use the Q&A function of the chat. I didn't introduce them at the beginning, but there is Mayanne and Lucy, without whom I would not be able to do this. They're actually monitoring both the chat and the Q&A, so please continue to put your questions, and I promise we will leave some 15 minutes at the end to tackle them. Before I go on, Peter, did you want to add something to this question?
No, I just want to emphasize the fact that HR's role in the whole employee assistance program is obvious, but I think we shouldn't rely on just having external professional consultancy. I think it's very important that managers are not trying to be psychologists, but are sensitive to people's feelings and are taught how to respond to people and when to know to refer them via HR to professional help as well.
I think that's a very interesting point, Peter, because I certainly see a lot more dialogues like this one, where we actually sit around the table from different perspectives, rather than just sort of, HR deals it from one end, and then sometimes there's a disconnect in between that. And certainly in the United Nations system, we've seen a lot more conferences and discussions just in our daily work as well, much closer cooperation between the colleagues on the medical, the psychosocial, the HR, but also the role of managers and leaders, which they don't need to be necessarily or at all clinically or medically trained, or HR trained for that matter, but they do need to know how to recognize these issues, how to open the conversations, and how to make sure that the referrals and the tools that are available are actually used and made available to staff. So that's a very interesting point, that we actually tackle this jointly and together as we learn together as we go on. So and now, Beth, I want to put you back on the spot because you, of course, we heard a little bit at the beginning from your work, and you are advising clients on critical strategic problems and information gathering. And we would like to hear from you, how do we build a culture of prioritizing well-being? How can technology, and by technology, all of it, from technological advances to digitization, how can that help promote better mental health support at work? I mean, I know it's a loaded question, but there's a lot we don't know in this space. So if you could give us some forward-looking perspective on some of the specific examples, that would be great. We really want to benefit from your experience here.
Yeah, no, of course. So I think I'd like to kind of answer those two questions slightly separately. So I think the first question was around, how can clients prioritize mental health? What clients do we, or what companies do we see who are very successful about making this a priority? And here, time and again, I think the most successful companies at dealing with mental health and making it a true priority are those who really engage with it as the right thing to do and as the duty of care that they're offering their employees, as opposed to something they're doing out of kind of social responsibility, or that they're seeing as a benefit, or even as they're seeing as something that is commercially important for them to tackle. You see the companies that are the most open to make these changes at all levels, which we talked about as necessary, are those who really kind of embed it as that idea as a responsibility they have to their employees, and something that then it's very easy to prioritize it and see it as central when you're framing these discussions all the time as part of your responsibility and your duty of care, as opposed to, a nice to have, a benefit, a way to retain people, a commercial imperative, etc. In terms of actually what people are doing and the way technology can help us do it, here there's kind of two broad things I'd want to mention. I think technology in general gives us flexibility and it gives us feedback. So on the flexibility side, digital tools just enable us to offer a range of services and for employees to find and teams to find what works for them and what works for the best for them in their context. So a good example here, I think, is Deloitte. So Deloitte actually offers its employees 7 different communication channels as standard for running meetings. So they can find the one that's best for them in terms of one-on-one conversations, that's best for them in terms of kind of ideating and brainstorming and running a brainstorming session, and what's best for them in terms of running a webinar like this with 60 people communicating or engaging with each other. And I think using technology to offer your teams that flexibility is a really great way that people can get the most out of digitalization. The second thing, the feedback thing, is obviously where my work tends to be focused and my kind of pet area. And I think the great thing that digital tools allow is it allows you to collect data that is anonymized and that is completely, cannot be traced back to individual employees, but about how your service is being used. And what that gives you is the feedback about what is actually helping, what's having an impact, what people are taking advantage of, and build systems that respond to that and respond to the lessons that can be learned from that data. So I think a lot of companies are guilty of creating really nice tools and creating really good avenues for people, and then being like, oh, congratulations us. And what they really need to do is to constantly monitor, using the data that these tools themselves generate, what's working and what's not and why, and using that to constantly improve the services on offer to their employees. One thing I hear time and time again is, oh, we established a helpline, but no one used it. And it's just like, okay, that's a good piece of information, but you've got to now find out why, etc. And taking that impetus to ensure that you're listening, you're not only creating services, but you're listening and refining is I think the other really big thing that digital tools allow us to do.
That's excellent, Beth. Thank you. I think that alluded earlier what you're saying, take audit of everything you do, but also don't forget monitoring and evaluation of not just sort of what works, but how does it work and what impact does it have in sort of immediate term, sometimes mid-term, long-term. But that's a very, very good point. And I certainly can think of examples when we create great things, but then we move on to another great thing and we forget about the first one. So thank you for that sobering reminder of that. Let me turn to Ulrike and Peter to see if they wanna add anything here, or we can move on.
Move on.
Okay. Peter, did you want to add something?
Only, I guess, digital.
Please feel free.
Digital tools we tend to have used to improve productivity, enhance communications and so on, but often haven't thought about using them to improve the quality of work as well as the quantity. And they tend to be there to increase productivity rather than improve the experience of work itself. And there's a lot of work done in the games industry, for example, to make dealing with technology a pleasure, and the whole human interface is designed. And I think that we need more of a merging of the entertainment industry technology and the business productivity technology to actually make a slightly more human use of technology itself. So it's not just turning us into machines, but actually is making life more human. And we hear a lot about artificial intelligence replacing professional work as well. If that's done in a productive way, that should release humans to do the more interesting stuff, not make life more boring or run by computers, which is the potential.
That's very true. Thank you very much for that, Peter. I mean, we've kind of touched upon different topics here. We talked about the how the whole issue of topic of mental health has moved up on the on the corporate agenda. We've seen the relationship. We saw the needs of both what can we do as employees, what can the companies do, what can each one of us do. But I just think like maybe for the last question, if we can get like really concrete and practical, I'm going to ask each one of you. Maybe let me start with Ulrike. Like what tips could you share, or maybe examples of good leadership practices that you have come across in your work that others could perhaps replicate or adapt to their own situations?
Yeah, I think the most important thing that I have seen and that we have gotten feedback from our employees worldwide, and we have a huge company, is that they really appreciated that their relevant managers would stay in constant contact with them. Some even said that they had more contact now than they used to have with their manager when they were in a big office, because you are in the office, although the manager is maybe a floor up or so. When do you really see him? Maybe once a week. But this whole virtual world and digitalization has kind of accelerated a number of processes and has facilitated that the managers get into contact on a daily basis. And it's not that they're interrogating their employees on what they're doing. It's just about having small group meetings, talking about things, cracking a few jokes, but having this constant report where they can speak to each other and about problems, and it always contains a bit of also personal asking how you are and what the weather is like. I mean, we're a multinational company. You talk about what your children are doing, and it's kind of replacing what you would do informally in the office, in the coffee corner or whatever. So that is something that we have found being extremely useful.
Thank you very much for that. I think I would like to buy a virtual coffee corner if I could, and I think it's very true what you say, because sometimes we miss these spontaneous interactions, and spontaneous creativity that sparks by walking around. So it's good to try to mimic that as much as we can in this virtual space. Peter, do you wanna add something on this, please?
Yeah, I think if there's one word I'd say is trust. Okay, which is often missing in organizations. A manager say, of course I trust my people, but I need to see what they're doing. I couldn't let them go work from home because I don't know what they're doing. As opposed to trusting that people will be self-motivated given the right organizational culture, and managers being prepared to let go. Manage by results, manage by getting, agreeing what people need to achieve, and then letting them get on with it. Treating them like adults, which is a lot of organizations we don't. We tend to treat people like children, because some of managers think their role is to tell people what to do. And I think that's the revolution in management that's been encouraged by the whole COVID experience, is that managers are having to learn to let go more, and it's forced them to trust their employees. And surprise, surprise, they found actually that creates a positive atmosphere and that people respond well, which again is good in the mental health category, because the people who work remotely but feel their manager is phoning them every day to check up on them, as opposed to check in with them, then they feel like they're being spied on. But if the manager creates the right environment where he or she is supportive, they're there to help and encourage people to achieve results and recognize their personal pressures at the same time, particularly with the home working, then that's a very positive atmosphere. But it all relies on mutual trust.
Thank you very much, Peter. Difference between checking up versus checking in. That's actually something I noted down to put in my toolkit. Very, very well said. And last but not least, Beth, I'm turning to you to add something here, please.
Yeah, I think to be very practical, one of the things that we've seen work very well in our own organization is to create online to have sensitive conversations. So company-wide webinar or company-wide Zoom call like this. But actually there weren't a lot of spaces to have this kind of one-on-one interactions where you might be able to raise something more sensitive. So one thing that we are kind of encouraging, or we've seen work quite well, is for managers to set up almost the equivalent of office hours. So instead of a meeting or a team meeting for an hour, breaking that down into 12 different 5-minute slots that people can sign up to and have that kind of 5 minutes with a leader one-on-one, so they can raise some of the things that potentially you wouldn't have the confidence to just say it in front of, even your 20 other or 5 other colleagues in your immediate team. So what I think that all leaders should be considering in this space is, what is the digital equivalent of knocking on your office door, and how are you replicating that online? What is available for people to meet you one-on-one in this digital realm?
Thank you, Beth, and I apologize, but I think we are losing you at the moment. So I think we're gonna give Beth a chance to probably restart the router, which I actually had to do a couple of times today. I think this is the joys of our virtual working. So we'll give Beth a chance to complete what she had to say. But I think, let me just see, we have asked for questions and we actually got quite a few. So thank you very much for that. I think what we will do now is we'll try to get to some of your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the next 15 minutes. So let me just start with the one that comes from Susan, who is actually asking, do you think public sector organizations such as the United Nations would be willing to adjust to their policies to keep up with these new realities? And if, what measures or recommendations would you have given your expertise? So who would like to tackle that? Is this something, Peter, you would like to take, or Ulrike, while we give Beth a chance to come back?
I'm not quite sure. It's the question asking about what do public sector employers should be doing, or is it a question of UN policy? I'm not quite sure what the question is. Sorry.
Yeah, it's more like, would the organizations such as UN, do you think they would be willing to adjust their policies to keep up with these new realities? And what kind of experience, what kind of recommendation would you give them, given your expertise?
Yeah, okay. We're talking about a shift from a world where it was run by people in power who delegated power to other people, but essentially kept a lot of power to themselves, to one where we have genuinely empowered people at the bottom end, whether it's within organizations or in society more generally, and we recognize that individuals have a role to play, and I think we get a lot of public sector organizations that are very traditional, hierarchical, very process bound, and it takes time to change the way the culture works, and they have levels of hierarchy in public sector civil service kind of organizations that are quite difficult to break down, and it's very structured. And you see maybe more in the private sector, the organizations that are more agile, more fluid, and less hierarchical. Those are the ones that are going to more succeed, I think, particularly with the younger generation coming through, who expect not to just salute and do what they're told, but who do expect to be given responsibility at an early age, and who want to be genuinely empowered to actually make decisions on their own part. And this is, I think, where the pandemic has forced some of that shift, because organizations have been forced to give people more power to get on and run their own lives. On the other hand, of course, in society, a lot of regimes have had to be very directive about, you can't go out, you can't do this, because to protect public health. So we kind of got the two things happening at the same time. But I think the general trend is towards more individual responsibility, more freedom, and less top-down directive management.
Thank you very much, Peter. So more flat organizations as we go on. The next question comes from Celine, and she's saying that we spoke about the role of the manager, the role of the EAP, the role of HR, all that makes sense. But how do we also best encourage a culture where colleagues look after each other? In other words, the role of the community. Perhaps Ulrike, would you like to talk about that or answer that question?
Yes, at least I can say from our side, and what I've seen in not only in our organization but also with our clients who are basically big corporations, international corporations, is that they are trying to foster a culture during these pandemic times of total inclusion, because it is really a critical time now where we see that inequalities, in social isolation, all these things are present, and it is all about fostering that kind of culture in the organization, and that goes down to the individual employee. So things like I mentioned before, like informal coffee mornings, all these things, and giving the colleagues kind of also opportunities to becoming creative themselves, like creating I don't know, videos of meetings that they've had and publishing it on the internal Connector webpage, whatever they have. So this is what I would suggest to do. It's hard, I understand, because obviously we are all in this new environment, and wider determinants of mental health, such as loss of employment, social isolation, all these things are impacting at the moment. So people have a lot going on and on their plates.
Oh, that's for sure. Thank you for that. I see that we have Beth back with us. So welcome back, Beth. Apologies for the technical glitches. We're bound to have them at least once in every session. So I think we're out of our quota now. But I want to get back to you in case you wanted to wrap up the earlier question about your practical tips you could share. And then I have a question for you from the audience. Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, sorry everyone on that. We have a slight electrical storm happening overhead, so internet is proving a little dodgy. Yeah. So the only other thing I wanted to add on my tips section was, I think we've talked a lot about flexibility and flexibility when it comes to policy. And one thing I would always encourage companies to do when thinking about this is, especially important in the next 6 months, when people are going to start to want to come back to offices and come back into their workspaces safely, making sure you have a policy in place that means that it's not just a rush, that's not just open to first come, first served, but the people who we've identified and talked about needing that resource, needing that physical location the most, have access to it. So making sure you have the policy in place that's smart, that says, okay, we've identified this group as most important, not just from a commercial standpoint, but also from a mental health standpoint for coming into the office, and making sure you have the space and the policy in place that they get back first.
Great, thank you very much, Beth, and I'm glad that we were able to hear that very useful tips for us. There's a question actually for you specifically coming from Susan at the World Bank, and she says that she was interested in your connection between increased remote work and the rise of global teams. And what she's seeing in her organization is this increased connectivity, but actually seeing more of a 24-hour work cycle for many staff around the globe. So any thoughts on how this is likely to work itself out to be more sustainable?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. I mean, I'm sure most people on this webinar have experienced it. I mean, this webinar is a classic example. It's very convenient for me in the UK time-wise, but it's not very convenient for Ulrike in Thailand. It's much later in higher afternoon. And I think the commercial imperative and the commercial gains of global teams, being able to access people, the best in the world, and being able to run a truly 24-hour service, means that you are seeing this expansion. And I think, Susan, you raised a really important point, that how these teams are managed, if there's one person who's managing this team, they can't be available 24/7 to do that, and making sure that you're, so yeah, I think it's a really, really important point. My advice for kind of companies looking at making more global teams and looking to staff things 24 hours is to really look at the managerial positions at the same time as the staff. So if you're hiring someone to work in a new location and you're assigning their manager to them, what working hours do they have that overlaps? And if it's, you know, only 2 or 3 in a day, being really open with both parties about how they're going to make that work, and checking in with them that that's actually working for them. And if, for example, something goes wrong and the junior party needs support, how do they access that out of hours without just, you know, bothering their manager during dinner or while they're asleep? And there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution there. I think that there are different things that companies can consider and work on. But the most important first step is, as Susan mentioned, acknowledging that this is going to be a problem. There's going to be a lot of commercial benefits. This is going to be the well-being problem that results, and that companies get ahead of it and make sure they have the support systems in place. Be that a local manager who's not as close to the content, etc.
For that, Beth. Let me see if we can get a couple of more questions in. So let me see, there's one that comes to us from Niha, who is asking what kind of leadership we will need in organizations moving ahead in the new world of work, not only with reference to remote working. How we enable this shift so that we are better prepared to take on the challenges of radical change in the future. Do I have any takers for this question? Okay, I was looking at you, Peter. I think you must have sensed my vibes. Over to you, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were on a route to more what people call servant leadership, and anyway, where I think we've in the 20th century we had the kind of heroic leader who led from the front. Now leaders have to earn that respect. They don't get it by virtue of having a big title and a big office. And particularly not now when the leader is a person in a square box on Zoom, the same as everybody else. They're not the person with all the trappings of the big office in the corner of the building on the top director's floor or something. So they have to much more lead by force of personality and being genuinely nice people and approachable people and people who inspire others. Leaders don't anymore get the respect by virtue of having a title. They get it by virtue of earning that respect. And so that's also back to the change in emphasis of where the power is in the organization. As HR people, we talk about empowerment all the time. We want to have a workforce that feels engaged, that is motivated and productive. All those things only come from genuinely having people feeling involved, feeling that their opinions are valued, and having processes, without them being too rigid, processes in place where people's opinions do get listened to and do get acted on. It's not the top managers who have all the brightest ideas in the organization. Actually, normally they're the dumbest. It's the young people coming in underneath who've got all the new vibrant ideas, and encouraging that in a culture is very important normally, but in times of change now, which we have, then what you can't do is rely on the old people in the organization who know the way it's always been done and saying, we'll continue to always do it this way, and I'll only promote somebody into my job in my image because I know best. That's gone. We're in an era of change accelerated by COVID, and that means that we end up having to be organizations that are agile and can change with the times. That does mean involving people and listening to them.
Very good points, Peter. Thank you. Nobody has a monopoly on knowledge and on ideas and creativity, certainly. So thank you for highlighting that. I think we have a couple more minutes for a couple more questions. Here's one that's dear to my heart. It's coming from Yelena, and she's asking, would you say that networks of peers as, quote, mental health focal points who are not in fact coach psychologists is useful for an organization to have? If they are, what kind of terms of reference do you think they should have? Any takers for this question?
I'm happy to take it. Yeah, okay, go ahead, Beth. You
please ask me. Please ask me.
Go ahead,
Okay.
Beth. Go ahead, Ulrike. Yeah.
No, we only have 2 minutes, so I'll be quick. I really like that question because that's exactly that goes to my heart directly. You don't need to be a doctor or a psychiatrist to be able to create this kind of environment where you can speak up, where you can share your thoughts confidentially, and I mean, we have that in our organization. We have a mental health champion in the bigger teams, and that's just one of the colleagues who volunteered for that, who has a special interest for that. and is obviously bound by confidentiality, and you can kind of bounce off all sorts of things of that person. Obviously, that can probably be enhanced and made like a small team, but over to you, Beth, so you get a chance to say something.
No, I definitely agree. And I think the one thing I would add is that I imagine a lot of companies have paused these, well, not paused, but have paused recruitment of these mental health champions during COVID, because the way they tend to be trained is in person. You have someone to facilitate that. And I would really discourage that as a practice. I think there is good online training for mental health champions that exists. We talked to providers during our own research, and I agree these peer networks play a really important role, and they should be being expanded and invested in during this period of mostly online working, and that can be done virtually.
Thank you very much, Beth. And I know we're at the top of the hour, and there's quite a lot of questions in there. I mean, we'll be probably happy to take some of them maybe offline and make sure we provide the answer. But I would be remiss if I didn't ask the last question, which came in. And it really, I think it pops up each time. And I think I don't want to be losing sight of that managers are people too. So given that, is there anything that you could, and I don't want to pick up on Peter all the time, but any of you would say something about that? How do managers, and many of them actually report the feelings of loneliness and oftentimes like not just not having the right tools or just not knowing which way to tackle situation, but they themselves also may experience mental health issues and burnout and stress and all of these things that we're talking about. So anything, how can we, tackle that as well?
Very simple. Managers are human as well, and they should act like humans. They should admit that they're not perfect and admit that they also suffer from stress at times. And then they get this, they can relate to their employees. They don't put themselves up on a pedestal or something different. Mm-hmm. They appear as humans. And in a funny way, this pandemic has helped that to happen.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And that includes the self-care as well, that managers that may be telling others to do, they should do themselves. Any last thoughts from you, Ulrike, as we wrap up?
No, just that it was a pleasure to be in this panel. It was such an interesting discussion. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you very much. Beth, over to you for final thoughts, reflections.
No, again, I think this conversation is so worthwhile and so needed in companies and in international organizations in the public sector, and great to have the opportunity to have it with you all this afternoon.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. And it definitely, this confirms the need that what mental health needs is more frank conversation, and the wider the group of people, the wider the group of professionals, I think the better. And I think we've, as we've gone along these almost 9 months now, who would have thought it, right? I think we've gotten some answers along the way, but we also got more questions as we go on. And I think this is probably something that's going to be here with us for a long time. The future is here, not to sound schablonic, but I think some of the old ways, what is good is going to remain, and we're trying to find ways to digitize it and improve it, but also there is a golden opportunity for us to just have a major shift in the way we work. And the word, there's one word that you all left me with is the word trust, and the word of flat organization, networked organization that actually thrives and takes care of itself by each one of us taking care of ourselves, our own mental health, but also making sure that we are productive and cooperative members of wider organizations. So it's really a great pleasure to have you all here. Thank you very much for our audience that was so engaging. I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance to answer each and every question, but we'll try to take that offline. On behalf of all my colleagues in AHRMIO, many of whom are on this call, from board members and also all of our executive staff, thank you very much for joining us, and have a wonderful day, and stay well. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.